The universe, in its infinite wisdom and questionable sense of humor, had produced some truly spectacular examples of civilizations getting too big for their britches. The Zephyrian Collective was perhaps the finest specimen of this cosmic joke, a species so thoroughly convinced of their own intellectual superiority that they'd actually legislated violence out of existence. Not metaphorically, mind you. They'd literally passed laws declaring it impossible for civilized beings to engage in physical conflict, then spent the next millennium congratulating themselves on solving one of the universe's oldest problems. It was a kind of breathtaking arrogance that would have been amusing if it weren't so tragically naive. The Stellar Academy of Advanced Consciousness sat like a crystal monument to this delusion, its impossible spires reaching toward stars that had probably seen this sort of thing before, and were politely waiting for the inevitable cosmic punchline. Inside its halls, the galaxy's most enlightened minds gathered to discuss the finer points of existence while carefully avoiding any topic that might involve raised voices, hurt feelings, or heaven forbid, actual consequences. Violence, according to the Academy's founding principles, was a relic of primitive evolution, something that advanced species had transcended through superior intellect and refined social structures. The very concept was so foreign to most students that they'd had to invent new words just to discuss it in theoretical terms. The Altarians called it intellectual malfunction syndrome. The Cine preferred emotional processing disorder. The Zephyrians, with their characteristic flair for the dramatic, termed it cognitive devolution crisis. It was all very academic, very proper, and about as useful as a chocolate teapot in a supernova. This enlightened state of affairs might have continued indefinitely, if not for the administrative decision that would later be remembered as the day someone forgot to check the fine print. The Academy, in a fit of progressive thinking, had decided to admit their first student from what the Galactic community politely termed a developmental world, though everyone knew what they really meant. Deathworld. The term itself was considered rather gauche in civilized circles. After all, it wasn't the planet's fault that they'd produced species stubborn enough to evolve under conditions that would make a reasonable civilization pack up and find somewhere more sensible to live. But sometimes diplomatic language couldn't quite capture the reality of worlds where natural selection had been less like gentle guidance and more like a cosmic boot to the face. Earth, as it happened, was such a world. The human who stepped off the transport that morning didn't look particularly dangerous. Kira Volkov stood maybe 5'6" in her practical boots, with dark hair pulled back in a style that prioritized function over fashion and clothes that seemed designed for actual use rather than aesthetic contemplation. She carried herself with a kind of easy confidence that made prey animals nervous and predators thoughtful, though since the Academy's student body contained neither, this subtlety was largely lost on her welcoming committee. The other students watched her arrival with the sort of fascination usually reserved for exotic zoo exhibits or particularly interesting traffic accidents. She moved through their crystalline halls like she was conducting a tactical assessment, her eyes cataloging exits, cover positions, and potential threats with the unconscious efficiency of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on such details. "How delightfully primitive," murmured Thexval Prismwing, adjusting his ceremonial robes with the kind of practiced flourish that suggested hours of mirror work. As a member of the Zephyrian noble class, he considered himself something of an expert on lesser species, having once written a paper titled The Aesthetic Tragedy of Stunted Evolution that had been very well received at dinner parties. Thexval was what you might charitably call a professional intellectual, the sort of person who had opinions about everything and the social connections to inflict them on others. His species had evolved from something vaguely serpentine, though millennia of genetic refinement had given them tall, elegant frames, skin that shifted color with their emotional states, and a superiority complex visible from neighboring star systems. "I do hope she won't find our advanced methodologies too challenging," he continued to his circle of admirers, his skin taking on the subtle golden hue that indicated smugness reaching critical mass. Deathworld species have such linear approaches to problem-solving. Kira, meanwhile, was forming her own opinions about her new academic environment. The Academy was undeniably beautiful in the way that completely impractical things often are, all soaring architecture and delicate materials that would probably collapse if someone looked at them wrong. The students glided through the corridors like they were performing some elaborate ballet, all graceful gestures and hushed conversations that suggested they'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through committee. It reminded her of the diplomatic functions her parents had dragged her to as a child, back before the siege of New Moscow had made such niceties irrelevant. Pretty, polite, and utterly divorced from any form of reality she recognized. She'd grown up in a world where politeness was a luxury few could afford and philosophy was something you contemplated after you dealt with the immediate problem of staying alive. When corporate raiders hit your settlement, you didn't form a mediation committee. You grabbed whatever weapons you could find and you fought back. When the terraforming systems failed and your crops started dying, you didn't debate the ethical implications. You fixed the damn machinery or you starved. It was a simple approach that had served humanity well during their expansion into a universe that seemed actively hostile to the concept of intelligent life. The first few weeks passed without major incident. Kira attended her classes, participated in discussions, and gradually earned a reputation for asking questions that made her professors uncomfortable. While her classmates debated the theoretical elegance of various conflict resolution protocols, she had an annoying habit of wondering what happened when those protocols failed. When they discussed the sophisticated diplomatic solutions favored by advanced civilizations, she wanted to know about contingency plans. Her professors found her refreshing in the way that cold showers are refreshing, technically beneficial, but not particularly pleasant. Her fellow students regarded her with a mixture of fascination and unease, like she was an exotic predator that might do something interesting and dangerous. Which brings us to the day when Thexval decided to test that hypothesis. It began, as these disasters often do, with an academic discussion that escaped containment. The subject was conflict resolution in post-scarcity societies, and Professor Volkov had just finished explaining the 43-step mediation process favored by the Altarian Commonwealth when Kira raised her hand. "That's a very comprehensive system," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "What's the protocol when you don't have time for 43 steps?" The class stirred with the kind of polite confusion that comes from hearing a question that doesn't compute. Professor Volkov's tentacles writhed in what might have been amusement or mild concern. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Miss Volkov. When would proper procedure not apply?" "When someone's shooting at you, for example." The silence that followed this statement was the sort of profound quiet usually associated with moments of great significance or really awkward social situations. Several students actually recoiled at the word shooting, as if the concept itself might be contagious. Thexval saw his moment and seized it with the enthusiasm of a predator spotting wounded prey. His skin shifted to a vibrant orange, the Zephyrian equivalent of cracking knuckles. "Ah, but you see," he said, rising from his seat with theatrical precision, "that scenario presupposes a fundamental breakdown of civilized discourse. In a truly evolved society, such barbaric situations simply cannot occur." "Is that right?" Kira's eyebrow arched in a way that suggested she found this assertion fascinating rather than convincing. "Never." "Never," Thexval confirmed, warming to his theme like a politician finding his stride. "Violence is the refuge of the cognitively impoverished, Miss Volkov. When minds achieve sufficient development, all disputes can be resolved through rational dialogue." "That's a comforting belief," she replied. "I suppose that works when everyone agrees to the same rules. Civilized beings always do. And when you meet beings who aren't civilized." Thexval's skin deepened to a rich burgundy, indicating both passionate conviction and a healthy dose of condescension. "Then it becomes our moral obligation to educate them in proper conduct. Violence, Miss Volkov, is never the solution." "Interesting theory," Kira said, leaning back in her chair. "The universe doesn't seem to have gotten that memo." The class was now watching this exchange with the rapt attention of spectators at a bloodsport, which was ironic, considering their species had theoretically evolved beyond such concepts. Even Professor Volkov had abandoned any pretense of organizing his lecture materials and was openly staring. "Perhaps," Thexval said, his voice taking on the haunted tone of someone delivering what they believe to be a killing blow, "your perspective has been constrained by your unfortunate circumstances. Those of us raised in genuinely advanced societies understand that alternatives to brutality always exist." "I'm sure they do," Kira agreed pleasantly, "when you have the luxury of choosing them." "Luxury." Thexval's skin flashed bright yellow, surprise mixed with indignation. "Miss Volkov, civilization isn't a luxury. It's an achievement. It's what distinguishes evolved beings from primitive species still trapped in their violent past. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Even students who'd been following the philosophical tennis match with detached academic interest began to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the conversation. Kira's expression didn't change, but something in her stillness suggested a predator taking careful stock of its environment. Primitive species, she repeated softly. I don't intend any offense, Thexval continued, though his skin coloration suggested he was rather enjoying himself, but you must understand how your background influences your worldview. Those of us who've never needed to resort to such crude methods have developed more elegant solutions. I see. Kira's voice remained level, but anyone with actual experience in dangerous situations might have recognized the warning signs. So anyone who's ever had to fight for their survival is essentially primitive. Not primitive, exactly. Thexval backpedaled with the magnanimous air of someone granting a significant concession. Simply, less developed. It's not a moral failing, of course. Environment shapes cognitive evolution, and your world was clearly quite harsh. It was, she agreed. People died there. Children, mostly. Killed by raiders who didn't seem interested in our elegant conflict resolution protocols. The classroom achieved a quality of silence that seemed to have physical weight. Thexval, sensing philosophical victory within his grasp, pressed forward with the confidence of someone who'd never been punched in the face. And that's precisely my point, he said, his skin now gleaming with triumphant gold. Such tragedies occur only where civilization has failed to establish itself. In a properly ordered society, those children would have been protected by law, by custom, by the very framework of rational discourse. You're absolutely right, Kira said, and for a moment Thexval basked in what he interpreted as capitulation. In a civilized society, those children would have been safe. Unfortunately, they weren't living in a civilized society. They were living in reality, where sometimes bad people do bad things, and all the elegant theories in the universe don't stop bullets. Then perhaps, Thexval said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that could be harvested for industrial purposes, the solution is to civilize the uncivilized, to teach them better approaches. And if they don't want to learn, then we persist with patience and understanding until they do. Violence, Miss Volkov, is never justified. Never. A truly evolved being always finds another way. Kira stood slowly, and something in the movement made several students instinctively lean away from her. She wasn't particularly tall or imposing in the conventional sense, but there was something about her presence that spoke of dangerous competence in a language their pampered minds couldn't quite translate. You know what, Thexval, she said, using his name for the first time. You might be right. Violence might be the refuge of the cognitively impoverished. The problem is, sometimes you encounter people who are both cognitively impoverished and heavily armed, and all your sophisticated dialogue doesn't mean much when they've decided they want what you have. Such individuals can be reasoned with, Thexval insisted, though his skin was beginning to show flecks of nervous blue. Given proper communication techniques, anyone can be made to understand the benefits of cooperative behavior. Anyone. Kira smiled, and it wasn't entirely reassuring. You seem pretty confident about that theory. I am. Violence is always a choice, Miss Volkov, and it's always the wrong choice. Always. Fascinating hypothesis. She began walking toward his desk, her movements casual but somehow predatory. So if someone approached you with clear intent to cause harm, you'd simply talk to them. I would engage them in constructive dialogue until we reached a mutually beneficial resolution, Thexval said, his voice steady despite the growing patches of blue spreading across his skin like a nervous rash. No matter what they threatened to do. No matter what. What if they threatened someone you cared about? I would find a peaceful solution. What if talking wasn't working? It always works, given sufficient time and proper technique. Kira had reached his desk now, close enough that she could observe the subtle tremor in his hands, the way his breathing had quickened despite his confident declarations. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow made it more ominous than any shout. You really believe that, don't you? I do. You believe there's no situation, no threat, No danger that would justify responding with violence. None whatsoever. It's a primitive reaction that has no place in civilized discourse. Hey. Kira straightened up, apparently pondering his words. The classroom was so quiet that the sound of her fingertips drumming against her legs sounded like a countdown timer. So if I were to, hypothetically speaking, present you with a clear physical threat right now, you'd handle it through dialogue. Thexval's skin flickered through several colors before settling on a sickly green that suggested his digestive system was reconsidering recent nutritional choices. Miss Volkov, surely you wouldn't. Oh, I wouldn't dream of actually threatening you, she said quickly. I'm just curious about your theory. Theoretically speaking, if someone from a Deathworld, someone primitive and cognitively impoverished, were to present an immediate physical danger, you'd resolve it through rational discourse. Of course. No matter how frightened you were. I wouldn't be frightened. Fear is another primitive response that evolved beings have transcended. Right. Kira nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying that your civilized approach would work on anyone, even someone like me. Especially someone like you. Your aggressive tendencies are clearly learned responses to environmental stresses. In the proper context, with adequate communication, such behaviors can be modified. You sound very sure about that. I am. Kira stepped back, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that would have looked casual if not for the way every muscle in her body seemed coiled for immediate action. Tell you what, Thexval, she said, her voice taking on a deceptively friendly tone. Since you're so confident in your theories, why don't we put them to the test? The blue patches on Thexval's skin were spreading like spilled ink, but his voice remained admirably steady. What sort of test? I mean, you keep insisting that violence is never necessary, that any situation can be resolved through proper discourse. But you've never actually been in a situation where violence was a genuine possibility, have you? I haven't needed to be. Evolved beings don't encounter such situations. Exactly. So how do you know your theories actually work in practice? The question hung in the air like a challenge to a duel, and even Professor Velkoth seemed to be holding his breath for the answer. Thexval's skin had achieved a color that could generously be described as morning frost, but more accurately resembled existential terror. Because, he said carefully, they are founded on sound logical principles and extensive academic research. Academic research, Kira repeated, conducted by people who've never actually faced violence. By people who've evolved beyond the need for violence. Right. So essentially, your entire worldview is based on theories that have never been stress-tested under actual conditions. They don't require testing. They are logically sound. Logically sound, she mused. Like the engineering calculations that said the Hindenburg was perfectly safe. Several students made small distress sounds at this reference to ancient Earth disasters, while Thexval's skin achieved new and previously undiscovered shades of pallor. Miss Volkov, surely you're not suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, she said cheerfully. I'm just wondering how you'd handle a practical examination of your theories. You know, put your credits where your mouth is. What kind of examination? Kira's smile could have powered the Academy's lighting grid for a week. Well, you keep insisting that any situation can be resolved through proper discourse, right? That violence is never necessary. Yes. And you believe this would work even on someone primitive and cognitively impoverished like myself? Yes. Excellent. So prove it. The silence that followed this challenge was so complete that it seemed to have mass. Even the building's environmental systems appeared to be holding their breath. Prove it how? Thexval asked weakly. Simple. I'm going to create a situation that would traditionally be resolved through violence, and you're going to demonstrate how your civilized approach produces superior results. I don't think. Come on, Thexval. You've been lecturing me about the superiority of evolved discourse for the past 30 minutes. Surely you're not afraid to demonstrate its effectiveness. The word afraid struck Thexval like a physical blow. His skin flushed with indignant orange even as the blue patches continued their conquest of his epidermis. I'm not afraid of anything, he said, his voice gaining strength from wounded pride. Least of all some primitive display by a Deathworlder. Wonderful. Kira clapped her hands together with apparent delight. So you accept the challenge? What challenge, precisely? Kira's expression grew contemplative, as if she was carefully considering the most educational approach to her demonstration. When she spoke, her voice carried the tone of someone making a perfectly reasonable proposal. I'm going to present you with a real-world scenario, she said. The kind of situation where someone from my background might traditionally resort to violence. And you're going to show all of us, how your superior intellect and civilized methods can achieve better results. Thexval's skin was now a fascinating kaleidoscope of colors, like a mood ring having a nervous breakdown. But his pride, that magnificent Zephyrian pride, wouldn't permit retreat in front of his social peers. Very well, he said, his voice steady despite his chromatic chaos. I accept your challenge. Present your scenario. Kira nodded approvingly. Excellent. Here's the situation. Imagine someone has been publicly insulting your species, calling them intellectually inferior and evolutionally stunted. They've suggested that your entire civilization is built on untested theories and academic masturbation. They've implied that when genuine danger arrives, all your pretty philosophies will collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. The classroom tension was now approaching critical mass. Thexval's skin had settled into a deep purple that indicated both anger and mounting anxiety. That's merely hypothetical provocation, he said carefully. Such behavior would be addressed through appropriate institutional channels. But what if there are no institutional channels? Kira interrupted. What if you're face-to-face with this person, and they just keep escalating? Keep pushing until you either respond or look like a complete coward in front of everyone whose opinion matters to you. I would continue engaging in rational discourse until... What if rational discourse isn't working? What if they are not interested in your logic? What if they just want to humiliate you for their own amusement? Thexval was quiet for a long moment, his skin cycling through various shades of distress like a biological lava lamp. Finally, he straightened his shoulders and met her gaze directly. Then I would demonstrate the superiority of civilized behavior through my actions. I would show them that their primitive provocations have no power over a truly evolved consciousness. Interesting approach, Kira said, taking a step closer. So if I were to say, for instance, that your entire species consists of overgrown peacocks who've spent so long admiring their own plumage that they've forgotten how to function in the real world, you'd just ignore it. The purple on Thexval's skin deepened to something approaching eggplant. I would observe that such statements reveal more about the speaker's character than about their intended target. Kira nodded thoughtfully. And if I suggested that the Zephyrian Academy is essentially an expensive daycare for spoiled children who mistake reading books for actual wisdom? I would note that your limited experience has provided you with a necessarily constrained perspective on educational achievement. What if I said that you, personally, are a pompous fool who wouldn't survive 5 minutes outside this artificial bubble you call civilization? Thexval's skin was now approaching wavelengths visible only to certain deep space telescopes. I would maintain that personal attacks represent the final refuge of those incapable of substantive intellectual engagement. And if I suggested that your theories about violence being unnecessary are the delusions of someone who's never faced genuine danger, that when the chips are down, you'd fold faster than origami in a blender. I would point out that your assumptions are based on cultural prejudice rather than objective assessment. Kira paused, appearing to consider his responses with the attention of a professor grading an exam. The class watched in fascination as this bizarre academic exercise continued, uncertain whether they were witnessing educational theater or something more dangerous. You know what, Thexval, she said finally. You're handling this remarkably well. Your civilized approach is definitely proving effective. Thexval's skin flickered with surprised gold. Thank you. As I explained, proper discourse can resolve any. Which makes what I'm about to do even more educational. The sentence dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples of alarm throughout the classroom. Thexval's newly golden complexion immediately began shifting toward panic blue. What you're about to do? Kira's smile could have been seen from the Academy's orbital traffic control. Well, we've established that you can handle verbal provocation through civilized methods. But what about actual physical threat? Physical threat. Thexval's voice cracked like an adolescent asking someone to prom. Nothing too serious, she assured him with the kind of casual tone usually reserved for discussing weekend plans. Just a small practical test of your theories. After all, you did say that any situation can be resolved through proper communication, right? Miss Volkov, I really don't think. Come on, Thexval. Don't tell me you're backing down now. Not when we're just getting to the interesting part of the experiment. Every survival instinct that millions of years of evolution had failed to breed out of Thexval was screaming at him to find the nearest exit and use it with maximum efficiency. But he was surrounded by his peers, his social circle, the people whose opinions formed the foundation of his self-worth. He'd spent the last hour delivering lectures about the superiority of evolved beings over primitive Deathworlders. Retreat wasn't just impossible, it was social suicide. What kind of test? He asked, proud that his voice only wavered slightly. Nothing complicated. I'm going to demonstrate exactly the kind of primitive, cognitively impoverished response that your people have supposedly evolved beyond. And you're going to show me how a truly civilized being handles such situations. She began rolling up her sleeves with the methodical precision of someone preparing for manual labor. The simple action sent waves of alarm through the watching students, several of whom had begun calculating distances to various exits. Miss Volkov, Professor Volkov interjected, his tentacles performing what could only be described as academic anxiety interpretive dance. Perhaps we should. It's perfectly fine, Professor, Kira said without breaking eye contact with Thexval. This is simply a practical demonstration of conflict resolution theory. Very educational for everyone involved. Thexval's skin had achieved a color that existed somewhere beyond the visible spectrum, a sort of ultraviolet panic that made him look like a living aurora having an existential crisis. But his pride, that damned, magnificent, utterly counterproductive Zephyrian pride, kept him anchored to the spot. I accept your demonstration, he managed. Outstanding. Kira finished with her sleeves and took another step closer, close enough that he could detect the faint scent of practical soap she used, something utilitarian and unscented that suggested efficiency rather than luxury. Now, Thexval, I want you to remember everything you've said about violence being unnecessary, about civilized discourse solving any problem, about primitive responses being the refuge of the cognitively impoverished. I remember. Good. Because I'm about to give you a very simple problem to solve. Her right hand curled into a fist, and the movement was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it took several seconds for its significance to register with her audience. I'm going to punch you in the face. Hard. And I want you to demonstrate how your superior intellect prevents it from happening. The words detonated in the classroom like a small tactical nuke. Several students actually gasped, or made whatever sounds their species used to express shock and horror. Others made distressed noises that probably translated as the equivalent of screaming in their native languages. Professor Volkov's tentacles knotted themselves into what could only be described as academic horror made manifest. Miss Volkov, he squawked through his translator. You cannot possibly be serious. Oh, I'm absolutely serious, she replied, her tone remaining conversational despite the promise of violence radiating from her posture. This is precisely the kind of situation Thexval has been theorizing about. Someone primitive and cognitively impoverished presenting a physical threat. It's the perfect test case. Thexval's skin had transcended color entirely, and was now existing in some quantum state of panic that defied conventional physics. You can't just hit me. Why not? Kira asked with genuine curiosity. I mean, according to your theories, you should be able to talk me out of it, right? Engage me in constructive dialogue until we reach a mutually beneficial resolution. But this constitutes assault. Only if I actually do it. Right now, it's just a threat. A problem for you to solve using your superior civilized methods. She took another step closer, and now they were separated by less than 3 feet. Her fist remained clenched at her side in a deceptively relaxed position that somehow made it more threatening than if she'd been waving it around dramatically. Talk to me, Thexval, she said softly. Use that constructive dialogue. Convince me not to punch you. Miss Volkov, please, this is completely unnecessary. Is it? You've spent the last hour explaining how violence is never necessary, how any situation can be resolved through proper communication. So resolve this one. Thexval's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. His carefully constructed theories about civilization and discourse seemed to have evaporated like morning dew. Standing there, confronted with the immediate reality of physical threat, all his academic knowledge felt as substantial as smoke. I'm waiting, Kira said pleasantly. Miss Volkov, he tried again. Surely we can discuss this like rational beings. We are discussing it. I've told you exactly what I'm planning to do, and I've given you the opportunity to prevent it. That seems pretty rational to me. But why would you want to hit me? Because you asked me to. You spent an hour explaining how people like me are primitive and cognitively impoverished, how violence is the refuge of the uncivilized. You implied that anyone who's ever had to fight for survival is essentially subhuman. And then you had the unmitigated gall to suggest that your untested theories could handle any situation, even when dealing with dangerous Deathworlders. Her voice never rose above conversational levels, but there was something in it that made the words hit with more force than any shout could have achieved. So here's your opportunity to prove it, Thexval. I'm giving you exactly what you asked for, a real-world test of your civilized approach. Stop me. I don't know how. The admission hung in the air like a confession of total failure. Here was this brilliant Zephyrian noble, heir to 3 millennia of intellectual evolution, confronted with the kind of simple, direct problem that his distant ancestors might have resolved without conscious thought. And he was completely, utterly helpless. That's honest, at least, Kira said approvingly. Most people in your position would still be trying to lecture me about the moral implications of violence. Please, Thexval whispered, and the word carried all the dignity of a civilization crashing into reality. Kira studied his face for a long moment, taking in the genuine terror, the complete bewilderment of someone whose entire worldview had just been revealed as elaborate fiction. Then she nodded once, decisively. Okay, Thexval, you've convinced me. Convinced you of what? That you really, truly believe everything you've been saying. That you honestly think violence is never necessary, that civilized discourse can solve any problem. You're not just spouting academic theory, you actually believe it with every fiber of your being. I do, he said, hope beginning to creep into his voice like sunlight through storm clouds. Which is exactly why you need to learn this lesson. Her fist moved with a kind of precise, economical motion that spoke of extensive practice and absolute commitment. No dramatic wind-up. No telegraphed haymaker that gave him time to react, just a short, efficient punch that traveled perhaps 18 inches from her hip to his jaw. The sound it made wasn't particularly impressive. Just a solid thunk, like someone dropping a heavy book on a desk. But the effect was immediate and comprehensive. Thexval's eyes went wide. His skin flashed through every color in his emotional spectrum, simultaneously creating a brief rainbow effect. And then he folded like a complex piece of origami, dropping to the floor with a grace that would have been impressive if it hadn't been entirely involuntary. The classroom erupted into chaos. Students shrieked in harmonies that their species typically reserved for natural disasters and religious ceremonies. Professor Volkov's tentacles writhed in patterns that probably constituted severe profanity in his native language. Someone activated the emergency alert system, filling the air with the kind of melodious chiming that civilized species used instead of sirens because regular sirens were apparently too aggressive. Kira stood over Thexval's prone form, flexing her fingers and examining her knuckles with the critical eye of a craftsperson checking their work. He was still breathing, still conscious, but his eyes had the glazed look of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just been physically reorganized. And that, she announced to the room at large, is what a primitive, cognitively impoverished response looks like. Notice how it resolved the problem in approximately half a second, with no need for 43-step mediation protocols or therapeutic interpretive dance. Campus security arrived with the kind of confused urgency that comes from having to respond to a situation that technically doesn't exist according to your training manual. They found Kira sitting calmly in her chair, hands folded in her lap like a model student, while Thexval slowly struggled back to consciousness with the assistance of several horrified classmates. "What happened here?" demanded the lead security officer, an Altarian whose tentacles were twitching with bureaucratic distress. "Educational demonstration," Kira replied cheerfully. "Practical application of conflict resolution theory." "She struck him," gasped one of the students, as if announcing the discovery of a new law of physics. "She actually struck him with her hand." The security officer's tentacles went rigid with shock. "Struck him? With what implement?" "Her fist," Professor Volkov supplied weakly. "She made her hand into a closed configuration and impacted him with it." "That's impossible," the officer said automatically. "Civilized beings don't engage in." "Yeah, well," Kira interrupted with a shrug, "apparently I'm not civilized." The aftermath was everything you might expect when a society built on the fundamental impossibility of violence suddenly discovers that the impossible has just punched one of their brightest students in the face. Forms were filed in triplicate, committees were hastily convened, and experts were consulted who had no expertise in the relevant area because the relevant area wasn't supposed to exist. The Academy's administration spent 3 days trying to figure out how to process an incident that their disciplinary codes didn't acknowledge could happen. It was like trying to prosecute someone for violating the law of gravity, technically impossible, but undeniably real. Meanwhile, Thexval spent those same 3 days discovering that getting punched does remarkable things to one's philosophical perspective. His jaw wasn't seriously damaged. Kira had controlled the punch enough to make her point without causing permanent injury, but his worldview would never fully recover. He found himself obsessively replaying the moment, not the punch itself, but the seconds leading up to it. The absolute certainty in her voice when she told him what she was going to do. The complete failure of everything he'd been taught when confronted with someone who simply didn't care about the rules of civilized discourse. It wasn't supposed to be possible, he confided to a friend on the second day, his jaw still swollen enough to affect his speech. "Violence is primitive. We evolved beyond it." "Maybe we evolved beyond needing it," his friend suggested gently. "That doesn't make it impossible."